Driving simulations were one of the first genres to be established on the home computer, with Checkered Flag for the ZX Spectrum arriving in 1983, followed by Jeff Crammond's Revs for the BBC Micro in 1984. Note the word simulation, rather than merely racing game. The distinction of sim versus not sim has been a bone of contention for decades, particularly in the post-PS2 era, where even arcade racers have relatively plausible car handling. So let me set out a definition. A driving simulation attempts to replicate the physical behaviour of a real-world vehicle as closely as possible within hardware and programming constraints. Or, as we said in the early 90s, it's one of those games where you have to use the brakes. Here is where we get to an enormous bone of contention responsible for thousands of newsgroup and forum flame wars over the years, especially once consoles started to muscle in on the PC status as the only place where the serious games were kept. Where is that line drawn? Take Gran Turismo 2. It attempts to replicate driving physics as closely as possible using the limited resources available on the PS1. It uses the performance data of its real-world vehicles. But it also features grippier tyres as a concession to gameplay, and the need to accommodate D-pad controllers. So, not a sim. But hang on. If I was serious about entering my car into a Gran Turismo style competition, where apparently you can turn up in your ordinary estate car, and no one bats an eyelid about regulations or tech inspection or dogs in the boot, surely one of the first things I'd do is fix extra sticky tyres. So perhaps it is a sim. But hang on again. By the standards of today's games, the handling model is laughably primitive. You can't possibly claim this is any sort of simulation. But super hang on. While it may be primitive, the handling is definitely more realistic than that featured in Revs, which is frequently cited as the first ever sim. So even if you're basing things on absolute terms, rather than what was possible on the hardware at the time, then it must be a sim. But hang on GP. This doesn't represent any licensed race series. Where on earth would you see an event lineup of a Nissan Micra, a Mazda MX-5, and what appears to be someone's dad's BMW 5 Series? Outside of the 24-hour Tesco car park at 3 AM, I mean. It can't be a sim. But Sega Manx TT Superbike, another landmark title in the history of driving simulations, is hard driving, where you go over jump ramps and round loop the loops. If that's a sim, then... Now imagine the people having this argument are 15 years old and have never driven an actual car in their lives, and you have some idea of what it was like to be into driving games in the early 2000s. Which is why that era spawned so many mods which drive like the track is covered in ice, and you've got 4 flat tyres. But why did anyone think harder equals more realistic in the first place? You only have to observe an actual road to see that operating a normal everyday car without it spearing off said road in a cloud of tyre smoke every few seconds is not quite the near insurmountable task xRacerX420_69's sim review page made it out to be. I imagine the fictional xRacerX420_69 got quite a shock the first time they had a driving lesson. But this portrait of the early 2000s is quite a long way into the history of sim racing. And an even longer way from the kind of physics engines used by Checkered Flag, Revs, or indeed Gran Turismo 2. As anyone who had to draw a force diagram for A-level maths will remember, modelling even a single frame of real-world physics requires a ton of floating point calculations. If you're modelling something fast-moving like a race car, you need to run them many times per second to prevent a car being on a smooth track one tick and embedded in a curb or bump the next. Typically, 100 is the absolute minimum for any serious simulation, meaning at 220 miles per hour, there's one physics sample for every metre the car travels. Most sims today are over 300. Early CPUs were slow. Worse, they didn't even have dedicated floating point units, so doing a floating point calculation, of the kind you'd need for a general purpose physics engine, was a very slow operation on an already slow CPU. And wait, didn't I just say this needs to run at least 100 times per second? While the CPU is also trying to transform polygons and run the AI. Earlier simulations got round this by using an innately 2D model, which is both simpler to calculate and less affected by changes in track geometry, meaning it can run at a lower rate. 1994's NASCAR Racing by Papyrus is a good example. Forces are resolved on a plane. Accelerating pushes the car forward. Steering gives it angular momentum. Even forces like the banking of the track pushing the car inward and downforce increasing grip are modelled. And if the angular momentum of the car exceeds the programmed in grip of the tyres, I will spin out quite realistically. But while this was state of the art for 1994, the compromises are easily apparent. Because this is a 2D engine, the car is glued to the track. The suspension rising and the skid sound as I accelerate are just canned effects. This is supposedly a 700 brake horsepower rear-wheel drive car, but if I steer hard to one direction and floor the throttle, nothing untoward happens. The game simply doesn't model the forces at the level of individual wheels, meaning there's no way for it to simulate the loss of lateral friction at the rear. That 2D nature of the engine is most obvious when there's a big crash. No matter how enormous the impact, every car stays stuck firmly to the ground at all times. I mean, NASCAR fans correct me here, but I don't think the 1994 season involved cars with massive ducted fans like the Brabham BT46. Papyrus wanted to improve these physics from an early stage. Developer Dave Kaemmer talked about a prototype based on one of the IndyCar racing games, where they replaced the 2D model with a 3D one, simulating each wheel independently. It took several minutes of calculation just for the car to settle on its suspension after the physics were initialized, a process which normally takes less than a second in real life. But they continued to refine it and optimize it, and CPUs continued to get faster until... I'm going to leave you to guess what game that resulted in. First, let me talk about simulation in 3 dimensions. Most 3D simulators use some variation of rigid body dynamics. In this, objects are modelled as primitives, with a mass and moments of inertia in all 3 dimensions. Forces applied to the body are converted into angular and linear acceleration. To model wheels, the engine casts 4 rays from the car body to the ground. The intersection point is compared to the current suspension length and wheel radius. This produces a force vector, which is applied directly to the body to keep it off the ground, but also multiplied through a tyre model to provide the longitudinal and lateral forces of acceleration, braking and cornering. Tyre models can get very complex, taking into account the position and rotation of the wheel changing as the suspension moves through its arc. The first Papyrus game with a 3D raycasting based physics engine was, and I know you're waiting for this one because it's a classic of the genre, Gripped, Soda Off-Road Racing in 1997. Alright, this was Software Allies, an organisation which included Papyrus and not the team on their own. Also, without access to the source code, I can't tell for certain what's going on physics-wise, but it certainly moves as if the wheels are being raycast independently, and the trucks are 3D objects. To illustrate why I think this, let me show you classic DSi game Stunts, or 4D sports driving as we knew it in the UK. This has some clever hacks on top of a regular 2D engine to allow cars to loop loops or fly through the air. But note how when I go off a jump at an angle, the car stays flat relative to the ground, apart from this canned tilt effect in one dimension. Now note the same in Soda. The vehicle body rotates realistically in all three axes. Its clear suspension modelling was in its infancy though, as some of the movements when it lands are a little unnatural. The problem is this increase in physical sophistication also makes the game incredibly difficult. Perhaps going from forgiving cars in forgiving 2D engines to accurately simulating 800 brake horsepower, two-wheel drive and dirt was not the smartest idea. Soda Off-Road Racing achieved a reputation for being utterly impossible. I found my copy in a bargain bin only a few weeks after release, and most of the time I just used the track editor to make ridiculous jumps and other stunts. In 1998 came the title you were probably thinking I'd say, Grand Prix Legends. This was the Velvet Underground and Nico of sim racing, in that while it only sold 1,000 copies, everybody who bought it made their own racing simulation. Okay, maybe not quite that literally. I mean, possibly, I did buy it and I did actually make my own driving simulation. But GPL did sell only 200,000 copies, not helped by steep hardware requirements, in addition to the lack of accessibility and obscure subject matter. And it was enormously influential in sim racing. One oddity of these early 3D sims is they all chose to model cars that are notoriously difficult to drive, and require feats of near superhuman skill to drive fast. Soda Off-Road Racing, Grand Prix Legends, and 1998's other sim title, Viper Racing, featuring a sports car that was notoriously unforgiving to the ham-fisted and lead-footed. Plus the hardware wasn't up to it. Grand Prix Legends feels great on a modern 900-degree wheel with force feedback. But at the time the most popular consumer wheel controller, the Thrustmaster T2, only had 270 degrees of rotation, no force feedback, and a potentiometer that was notable for getting dirty and causing input spikes. And having a wheel at all was rare. Most players used a joystick. Early versions of GPL didn't have force feedback support at all, due to the few wheels on the market only being able to provide primitive thumps and rumbles that didn't match anything you would experience in a real car, unless it was broken. So driving the most influential of the early sims was bastarding hard. Because driving a real 1967 Formula 1 car is bastarding hard. Even more so if someone has set it up incorrectly, a well-known problem with the default car setups Grand Prix Legends shipped with. You could make the car a lot more forgiving if you were prepared to spend a few hours in the garage window. But many weren't, and many of those who did failed to understand what changes to make to smooth off the rough edges of those challenging cars. This all led to the misbelief that if a sim was realistic, it would also be hard, even if it was simulating vehicles with less power, more weight, and vastly better tyre and suspension technology than a vintage Grand Prix car. Something that persisted up until actual race drivers started using sims to practice, and explained that the last thing they wanted to enter in a 24-hour GT3 race was a car that snapped into uncontrollable slides at the slightest provocation. Even if misguided, this was a desire for more realism, and sim developers continued to oblige. The models were upgraded, with faster simulation rates, additional rays to better approximate the shape of a wheel, and submasses on springs to simulate the effect of fuel sloshing around in the tank. But the rigid body simulation remained largely, well, rigid, which isn't quite accurate. As anyone who's driven an old convertible can tell you, cars are not entirely rigid. All materials flex to some degree, and a car's chassis is no exception. It takes a lot of force to make it flex only a small amount. But guess what racing around a track exerts? And guess how much flex is required to alter the suspension geometry and affect how the car goes round a corner? For the avoidance of doubt, that's a lot of force and not very much flex. A physics model which better handles this effect is a spring and mass model. These were commonly found as desktop toys in the late 90s. In a spring and mass model, you don't have rigid bodies. You have nodes and springs, or beams, connecting them. If you wanted to model a car, you'd set up some nodes and beams representing the chassis and suspension. Forces would then be transmitted through the network, resulting in the car body translating, rotating, and flexing. The problem is this requires even more calculations than the rigid body model. It also has a very particular type of problem, endemic to computer physics. When there are very stiff springs involved, a small difference in length results in a big difference in force. The floating point numbers used in computing are imprecise, and they get less precise the larger the number gets. It's easy for a small difference to roll over into a big difference. And if this happens over multiple springs, it puts so much force into the system, it explodes. To solve this, the physics engine needs to run even more times per second. This resulting smaller time step keeps the distances and forces small, in the region where floating point numbers are more accurate. But this means even more calculations. On a physics model, where you already need many more calculations than a rigid body one. So it's no surprise that just as rigid body models weren't feasible until the MMX era, spring and mass models didn't arrive until CPUs started approaching the 1 GHz barrier. The first one I encountered was One Sane, and yes, I am going to pronounce the title like that, thanks for asking. This uses very simple spring networks, but you can see the vehicles bounce and shimmy as I tear across the land, and they bend pleasingly into contorted shapes after a crash. Unlike Carmageddon, which uses a rigid body model, this affects the suspension placement, meaning a banana-shaped Jeep will end up fit only for driving in circles. One Sane also demonstrates how to make spring and mass models more manageable. One way to prevent large forces building up due to a network of stiff springs is simply make the springs softer. Ergo, they can stretch more for the same amount of force. Who would have thought you'd idly click through videos on retro YouTube and end up staring Hooke's Law in the face, eh? The other thing we're staring in the face is that sim argument. In one sense, One Sane is a very good off-road sim with different amounts of surface friction, simulation of differential locks and drive configurations, and those spring and mass physics. But it's also clearly designed for madcap arcade action. Here is where we finally get within striking distance of the game I mentioned in the title. Something about chassis flex. It's much more noticeable in large vehicles. Your bus driver doesn't have to be throwing the bus around a racetrack for you to notice its shake and flex. So it makes sense that a large vehicle simulation would benefit more from using a spring and mass model for general simulation rather than just entertaining crashes and out-of-control landings. Rigs of Rods was a physics experiment by Pierre-Michel Ricaudel, released to the public in 2005. The models feature more beams and more nodes than the simple chassis of One Sane, and you can see the impact this has by the system requirements. Rigs of Rods demanded a 2 GHz Pentium 4, whereas One Sane would run on a Pentium 3 at a quarter the clock rate. This bizarre and demanding approach to physics modelling fascinated those who played with it. The idea of trying to lift a heavy object with a crane and not being sure whether something would bend or break was entirely new, and the ability of vehicles to realistically deform after collisions and have it affect their handling was just as rewarding as it was in the more arcade One Sane, especially if it resulted in an excuse for a protracted crane rescue. While early vehicles were simple, Rigs of Rods added features to facilitate more detailed models that still deformed and flexed realistically and mapped with different surfaces. A couple of content creators made a name for themselves producing such detailed maps and realistic vehicles: LFJ Hutch and Gabester. Gabster's cars in particular showed off what was possible with the engine, including the Burnside and Gavril Bandit. Any of those names sound familiar? At the start of the 2010s, a group of Rigs of Rods developers and content creators, including those two, wondered what would be possible if you started again from scratch, knowing what the Rigs of Rods community had learnt over the previous few years. They produced some early videos of a pickup truck bouncing over some suspension tests in CryEngine, and eventually a tech demo with what felt like unfeasibly high system requirements for the time. Yes, we're finally here. BeamNG.drive. Early public releases came in 2013, followed by Steam Early Access in 2015. Yes, it's been in development a long time. One advantage of that is the steep minimum hardware requirements now feel more like descriptions of vintage hardware. Rather than requiring a top-of-the-line PC to drive a single car at a low frame rate, you can run multiple vehicles even on mid-range hardware. It helps that the team have optimised the engine many times over the years. However, even on a fast CPU, more than 4 or 5 vehicles still becomes a struggle, due to the sheer number of nodes and beams which need to be simulated. Orders of magnitude more calculations than even a complex rigid body engine. The other thing the BeamNG.drive team have done is turn an interesting physics idea into a top-of-the-line simulation. Spring and mass models easily solve some problems which are difficult for a classic rigid body approach. For example, you don't need to work out equations for the motion of McPherson strut or double wishbone suspensions. You just model them using nodes and beams. Rather than try to fake force feedback with clever models, you can just take the force exerted on the steering node. But other problems are more difficult to solve. While you can easily build a wheel out of springs, and it will deform and conform to the terrain like a real tyre, you still need to define what the coefficient of friction between node and terrain is. And this has traditionally been the bane of spring and mass engines. Rigs of Rods went through multiple tyre models, oscillating between trucks being able to climb near vertical cliff faces, and then, next release, struggling to drive up a gentle incline. So while it's the real-time deformation that remains the eye-catching part of BeamNG, and the chassis flex which excites physics nerds, the real achievement for me is connecting this all to a tyre model which does what you expect tyres to do. And by my earlier definition of simulation, this is the pinnacle. Yes, Assetto Corsa might have better feel than real cars, but BeamNG.drive tries to simulate nearly everything. You can overheat your engine, bash off a wing mirror, lose your hubcaps, end up with oil leaks from scraping your sump, and you will really feel it if you strike a curb at speed. While the vehicles may not be real-world in the slightest, they are very much real-world analogues. I've owned or driven cars very similar to the Corvette, the Pessima, the Grand Marshal, the Sunburst, and of course the ETK 800. Each very faithfully reproduces its archetype. But will we ever see these physics in a regular racing simulation? Well, the CPU requirements are still a little high, and it's taken the BeamNG team a long time to get to where they have. You still couldn't simulate a 22 car field with this technology, and it's not going to give you a consistent 60 FPS on console hardware. Plus, car manufacturers would not be happy seeing their products treated to the kind of realistic deformation that makes you resolve never to have a head-on collision in a Gavril Barstow. But we are seeing rigid body physics simulations introduce approximations to close the gap. Assetto Corsa Competizione has featured canned flex modelling since 2019. And who knows what future CPU architectures might result in for computer game physics. Just like Dave Kaemmer with his IndyCar, taking minutes to experience a second of real time, maybe somewhere out there, is somebody building the transformational leap in driving simulations for the next decade. Until then, we have BeamNG.drive. It's made of springs.